everyone. We hope that you're having fun. So our next segment is with Matt Boone. He is a licensed social worker. He's the Director of Programming and Outreach for our Student Wellness Program. And if you haven't taken one of his mindfulness sessions, you really need to take the time and do so. At noon every day, Monday through Friday, we have a mindfulness session that's hosted by the Mindfulness Program. If you'd like a link for that, you can find that on the Get Healthy website. So Matt, I'm ready for you to take it away.
Okay. Natalie, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. So today I'll be talking the next 20 minutes or so about working through stress. And my hope is that this approach to stress will be a little bit different from what you're used to seeing and the kind of messages that you're used to giving yourself around stress. So usually, we're all looking for some kind of balance, right? The perfect balance between work and life and play and our spirituality and our families. And we have this ideal in our minds of this kind of perfect balance, a balance that is pristine and uniform and always works out for us. And we often find that we're failing a little bit according to that ideal. We're not living up to it. And then we think, what's wrong with us? But I would suggest that balance is more like this. There is no perfect balance. There is no work-life balance unicorn out there that we can somehow find. We can keep striving, but we also have to be kind to ourselves along the way because it's hard. And we sort of know the things we need to be doing. If you are a medical professional or you live in the world and spend any time on the internet, you kind of know that what you need to do for stress are things like get a good sleep every night and eat healthfully and get regular exercise and spend time with family, social networks and friends, whatever they look like. But often we find that time works against us. In fact, time can be a little bit of a demon, plaguing us, telling us that we don't have time to do it all, and leaving us feeling behind, like we can't keep up. Well, what we'll do today is we'll re-envision self-care for a moment. I'll suggest practices to help you engage more meaningfully in self-care. And then at the end, I'll give you a small call to action about making a difference with your self-care. So what do we think about when we think about self-care? If you Google self-care and come up with a bunch of images, you probably get something like this, like it's a massage, it's a bubble bath, it's getting your toenails painted. But you know, this message can become part of that ideal that we're never living up to. And as a result of that ideal, in our minds, we might develop what I call the inner self-care tyrant. And I'm wondering what your inner self-care tyrant says. I should be exercising 7 days a week. What's wrong with me? I can't even do 6. I wouldn't feel stressed if I would just meditate. As a meditation practitioner and teacher, I love how much people beat themselves up with how much they're not meditating. Or why am I not journaling more? Everything would be better if I was just journaling. Or can't I sleep enough? I'm not getting enough sleep. Or, you know, insert here. Everything would be better if I would just, you decide. And noticing in that social comparison kind of way, everyone else is balancing their life much better than I am. Whew. That's really hard to live up to and not a very kind message. So what about another kind of self-care? A self-care in which we turn our attention toward and our energy toward those kinds of practices like sleeping, eating, taking breaks, spending time with family and loved ones. But we do it in a way that is softer, gentler, more open, and less self-condemning. So to do this, I'm going to suggest 3 practices that will help you engage in this different kind of self-care, whatever the self-care practice is. I'll invite you to think flexibly, practice self-compassion, and live your values. Let's start with thinking flexibly. So, if you're paying any attention to your mind and to the minds of the people around you, you will notice that we have a lot of thoughts. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of thoughts over a course of a day, and God knows how many over the course of our lives. And it can feel a little bit like this, like a crowded space, and not nearly as beautiful. In fact, it can be the source of a lot of frustration and suffering for us. I'm going to point you to 3 categories of thoughts that can make our lives difficult and tend to show up kind of universally in stress, in anxiety, in depression, in all the things that I see in my office and all the things that we suffer with. This is an exhaustive list, but it's pretty useful to start with these and start noticing them in your mind. I call these thinking traps. And the first one of these thinking traps is probability overestimation. That's overestimating the likelihood that something bad is going to happen. So you've probably noticed that humans are really into predicting. Like, we predict tomorrow's weather, we predict who's going to win the next football game, we predict who's going to win the next election. But you know, we're not very good at it. Even the so-called experts are rarely more than 50% accurate despite their expertise. And that's no better than chance. So notice if you tend to do that, to predict that bad things are going to happen. The next thinking trap is catastrophizing. You may have heard this word. This is making a mountain out of a molehill. Or more specifically, not only will a bad thing happen, but that it's going to be really bad or a catastrophe if it does happen. It's not just a little flood, it's a giant flood. Think to yourself and notice if that's what your mind offers you sometimes. Does it kind of inflate how bad things could possibly be? And check your experience. How often do things end up that way? The final category of thoughts are shoulds. Shoulds are mental rules for how the world should be, people should behave, and if you point it inside you, how you, the people, should think and feel. You usually can recognize them because in your mind, you think something like, I should be doing more work, or I shouldn't feel so stressed. But when we pay attention to our experience, we notice that we just feel what we feel. And sometimes it's harder to push ourselves to do more, or what have you. So shoulds, though, having rules can be useful for us. They can also tyrannize us and can be like this guy, scolding us for not doing more or not feeling the right thing. So how do we respond to these? Well, first, let's summarize them a little bit. So here's an example of probability overestimation. There's no way I'm going to get a good grade in this class. Do you think things like that? I know some people watching might not just be students, but I'm gearing this towards students. If I don't get a good grade, I'm totally screwed. That's catastrophizing. Or I should think positively. I shouldn't feel so stressed. I should be studying right now. Those are should statements. Think about how useful these thoughts are. Not so useful often, though they tend to show up for most of us. Well, I'm going to offer you a way to respond lightly. Here's a quick method. And my slides will be available, and this video will be available, so you can review it. You don't have to memorize it right now. So first, label. Notice the thinking trap. Is it probability overestimation, catastrophizing, shoulds, or something else? Like trying to read people's minds or thinking in all or nothing ways. Then examine its utility. Once you've noticed the thought and labeled it, is this thought useful right now for what I'm going after? Is it the right tool for the job? Or is it maybe a hammer when we need a wrench? Then ask yourself, is this a habit? Is this thought familiar? Have I thought things like this in similar situations? Chances are your thought is a habit. In fact, most thoughts are habits. And when we begin to recognize that, we begin to notice that our minds aren't these like master diagnosticians of our own behavior and the world. They're just spitting out the thoughts that they spit out habitually in these kinds of situations. And then finally, when you've noticed all that, labeled, examined the utility, noticed if it's a habit, then take action, right? Our hands and our feet and our voices can do things that are different from what our mind is telling us. So what would I be doing right now if I wasn't focusing on this thought? What's the next action you would take? So let's apply this real quick. Let's go back to one of those thoughts. If I don't get a good grade, I'm totally screwed. Let's label it. It's catastrophizing for sure. It's imagining if a bad thing happens, like not getting a good grade, then it's going to be really bad. Like it's a slippery slope to my whole life falling apart. Then ask about its utility. Is it useful? Not so much. It takes me away from focusing on my studying, right? If I'm focusing on that thought, I'm not actually absorbing the material, and I'm working at cross purposes to what the thought is trying to do for me, which is protect me. Is it a habit? You might say to yourself, it's definitely a habit. I tend to think this every time I sit down to study during a time crunch. Then finally, what's the action? I'm going to take a deep breath, stretch a bit, and refocus on the concept in front of me. This is what I really want to do in life, helping others. This test, however exhausting, however tiring, is part of the bigger picture of something I care about. This points to my third practice I'll offer you, which is values, but we'll get there in a second. So that is thinking flexibly. And it's something you can develop a skill at and practice on paper or in your mind to give you just a little bit of distance from the kind of negative stuff that our minds kick out all the time. Our second practice is practicing self-compassion. So a lot of times we talk about, that person would behave differently or they'd do things differently if they thought better of themselves, if they had higher self-esteem. Well, it turns out that self-esteem is a hard thing to change. And when we do, it actually can have some unwanted side effects, like people being too focused on themselves or, a little bit narcissistic. And maybe we're confusing the outcome for the process. Like people tend to have higher self-esteem when they do things that give them a sense of accomplishment. So let's go at something else, because you're not always accomplishing something. So what about self-compassion? It's the antidote to that kind of negativity that we offer ourselves. Self-compassion is not cheery, positive thinking, and it's not ignoring what's hard. It's more about offering yourself space, kindness, and grace. Kristen Neff at the University of Texas at Austin has created a conceptualization of self-compassion that involves three elements: self-kindness, which means being gentle and understanding with ourselves rather than harshly critical and judgmental; common humanity, which is feeling connected with others in the experience of life rather than feeling isolated and alienated by our suffering. So in a moment of suffering, kind of tuning into the sense that you are not the only one, that other people are going through this too. And then mindfulness. This is a specific facet of mindfulness, which is being able to hold our experience, so like our thoughts and our feelings, the stuff that happens inside of us, in this kind of balanced awareness, like just watching it without trying to push it away or stirring it up, exaggerating it. I often will say to myself and to the people I work with, feel your feelings, don't feed them or fight them. So imagine the next time you were suffering in some way. You've experienced a loss, a disappointment, an anger at the world. And instead of lashing out or lashing in, you offered yourself words of kindness. This is hard right now. It's hard to be in this place. It's hard to feel this. The kind of thing that you might offer your child, or, if your kitten or your puppy was sick, that kind of softness, but directed towards you. I promise you, it's not going to make you work less hard or care less about your life. It's just going to make all that easier. Then what if in that moment of pain, you recognize that this is something other people go through? Not in a way that kind of beats yourself up and says, everyone deals with this, get over it, but more like, wow, this is what connects me to other people. We all feel, our hearts all hurt. Think about how that might offer you a little bit more lightness as you carry your pain. And then finally, rather than turning away from whatever feeling you're having, an anger, a shame, a sadness, a stress, you just let it be. You were just aware of it, didn't push it away, but also didn't stir it up or add to the fire. Part of you may think, that sounds all well and good, but what if I just feel this forever? Well, it turns out all that criticizing yourself doesn't actually make feelings go away. Feelings pass on their own. This is the life course of every emotion that ever existed in the history of humanity, right? Everything we feel has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So if we don't try to push it down and we don't try to stir it up or exaggerate it, it's just going to go away on its own. We don't need to do anything to it. Sure, we can maybe distract ourselves a little bit or talk to a friend or do some journaling. But I would suggest doing that in the service of letting the emotion pass on its own, not in the service of trying to make it go away. Because it's really making it go away that makes it extend and come back and plague you and push you around. Dr. Neff offers this practice, a little words of kindness that capture all the facets of mindfulness, of self-compassion, self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness that I mentioned before. So when you're hurting, you might say something like to yourself, like, this is a moment of suffering. Suffering is a part of life. May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I give myself the compassion I need. Those are Dr. Neff's words, but she encourages people in her book, Self-Compassion, to come up with their own words. Like I might say to myself, this is hard right now. This shows up sometimes in life. This is stuff that other people experience too. I'm going to be kind to myself now. I'm going to offer myself a moment of compassion. If you have a spiritual practice, you could weave in a sense of the spirit or a higher being offering you this as well. Choose your own words. You can also physicalize it. Dr. Neff suggests a number of practices where we take the kind of gentle, loving gestures that we would offer to someone else and we offer them to ourselves, like putting our hands on our heart, maybe even rubbing it there, or even offering yourself a hug. I know The guy who's too cool inside me thinks that sounds really cheesy, but I sometimes do it, and it softens me, and it makes it easier to carry something so I can do what's important next in my life. So if you're thinking flexibly, not getting entangled in all those thoughts, and you're offering yourself self-compassion, being kind when you might otherwise want to be harsh towards yourself, from there, you can focus on your values. So values have a lot of different definitions in our culture, and I'm going to offer you a perspective on values that may be similar to what you know, but maybe a little bit different. So from this perspective, in the field of psychology that I operate in, values are directions. They point you in the direction that you have chosen for your life, even when things are hard. We often talk about values as things like family or work or citizenship. I would call these values domains. Like, these are the categories in which we live out our values. But that's the easy part. The part that requires a little bit of work is thinking about, how do we want to be in those domains? So I encourage you to pick words and phrases that describe meaningful patterns of ongoing action. Like, do you want to be compassionate, hardworking? Do you want to make an impact? Do you want to be curious? That's what we can choose. We can choose our actions. We can choose our stance. We can choose how we want to be or act on an ongoing basis. We can't necessarily choose whether we feel stressed or anxious or sad or angry in a moment, that hard stuff. We can't choose to feel compassionate in a moment, but we all know that we can act in a compassionate way. And often, but not always, our feelings follow our actions. These kinds of values are personally chosen, though you may receive them from your family and your culture, and perhaps your religious traditions. Those sorts of values that you kind of look at as a kind of conscious human being and say, yes, that works for me, and I choose that. So what will you choose? What kind of words do you want to bring with you, say, today, to your work, to your life, to your family, and to your self-care? These are just the words I could come up with, in a 5-minute brainstorm. So let's put it into practice. So let's say your values domain is education, imagining you're a student perhaps. And the values words you might pick are curious, engaged, collaborative, connected, and helping others. Things that you can control, right? Things you can do with your hands, your feet, and your voice. So you might develop a goal to develop close relationships with like-minded classmates. Like, that's an outcome, right? You can't control that, but you can put your energy into it. So what's an action you can take in the service of that? So maybe you invite 2 to 3 folks you've just met to Zoom coffee. Although at this point, I think we're all just a little bit tired of Zoom. The thing is, values dignify the normal pain and discomfort of living. Values aren't just about how you move your feet, they're about carrying your pain a little bit more lightly. So imagine that you are studying for an exam, or perhaps if you are a professional, like working with a difficult client and reviewing the chart. This is a hard moment. But what if this was about something bigger, like your values, being curious, engaged, collaborative, connected, and helping others? Isn't it kind of different in that context? Or what if you just got some information, a patient complaint, or a colleague had given you some feedback that didn't sit well and kind of hurt? But your stance was to be curious, engaged, collaborative, connected, and helping others. What if that's where you stood from? What would be different? How might you carry that pain differently? And these are words that don't have to live just in that one domain. They can live in any domain. Like, you can bring that to your family or anything you do in life. It's a way of having what you have, but putting your focus in front of you and not losing sight of what matters. So what's the practice again as we wrap up? Begin by thinking flexibly. Notice what your mind offers you. Notice that catastrophizing, probability overestimating, should statements, and all the judgments that you might make about yourself and others. And just notice. Notice the habits. Notice how useful they are, and take action that's not necessarily driven by those thoughts. Then practice self-compassion. Be kind to yourself when things are hard. You don't need to kick yourself when you're down. And being kind to yourself is not going to make you lazy or give up. It's going to smooth the way. And then finally, from that perspective where you're softer towards yourself, you're thinking flexibly, live your values, put your energy towards what really matters. And when it comes to stress, maybe that means sleeping a little bit more, eating healthfully, getting some exercise, spending time with family, friends, and community, whatever your community looks like, and maybe even getting that massage. But remember, there is no perfect balance. You will fall away, it will teeter, it will be a little bit precarious. Think of it more like this. Just keeping yourself up, doing the best you can, maybe a little bit wobbly, imperfect, but good enough. I'm Matt Boone. I work with the Student Wellness Program. There's my email. Feel free to reach out. I'm happy to be with you today. Thanks a lot.